Hoping for an episode of Locked On Grizzlies that didn't talk about Dillon the Villain Brooks. I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is most of this show will not be detailing whatever is going on and what isn't going on with the media and Dillon Brooks. The bad news is we are going to address it to start the program, and I've got a pretty spicy meatball of a take that I'm going to launch here to begin Locked On Grizzlies on this May the 4th be with you. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Grizzlies here on this Star Wars day, and it feels like Dillon Brooks is being treated like Darth Vader in a lot of circles. Not very fairly, I might add, but I'll talk about why that's not good for either side of the conversation here on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this show, Joe Mullinax. Michael Cole is dealing with all of the insanity that is the Dillon Brooks media onslaught that it seems to be happening on an almost daily basis now. Dillon's getting more attention now than he has ever in his NBA career. I don't know if he likes that or not. But DeMichael is handling those issues. I, Joe Mullinax, Grizzlies columnist over at Bluff City Media, as well as a contributor to SB Nation. Been covering this team for 10 years. I have followed Dillon Brooks' career every step of the way to this point. I am happy to be here with you on this edition of Locked On Grizzlies. And this episode, like every episode of Locked On Grizzlies, is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check us out on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. However you get your podcast fix in each and every day, hopefully Locked On Grizzlies is a part of that process for you. Dillon Brooks. The name in the news continues to be there. The Memphis Grizzlies say they potentially, what's going on there. Dillon Brooks says, I don't know what's going on there. The agent for Dillon Brooks comes out and attacks Shams Charania of The Athletic. It makes it seem like it didn't come from Dillon Brooks' camp. I'm not sure it makes sense that the leak of Dillon not returning to the Memphis Grizzlies makes sense from a Grizzlies perspective. So here's my spicy meatball that I alluded to earlier. I don't think either of them did it. I think an agent for another player did. Now, is it another Grizzlies player? Is it somebody with Oregon Duck connections that's in the NBA? Is it another Canadian player? Maybe there's a combination there. Again, I'm speculating. I want to stress that. No inside sources per se on my end. But I do want to stress that I don't think either the Grizzlies or the Dillon Brooks camp leaked the Shams Charania report that Dillon's not coming back under any circumstances. And the reason why is leverage. It doesn't make logical sense, at least not to me. And again, I've been following this team for a while, followed Dillon Brooks' career to this point. It makes sense that they both want to part ways, like we talked about on the Wednesday edition of the show. That piece of this makes sense. Dillon Brooks sees himself as something more than he probably is, at least on a good basketball team in the NBA, offensively. He was an offensive liability this past season. No disputing that, at least not on my end. He was an issue there. He had literally the worst season of his career scoring the basketball. Is that because he was uncomfortable, because he was being asked to be a 3-and-D player, to use his words? Is that because he simply just fell off a cliff with his efficiency? It's probably a combination. But I do believe that the mutual parting makes sense. Dillon wants a different role. The Grizzlies don't see him in that space, understandably so, given the way that their roster is made up. The time has come to say goodbye, and that doesn't make the previous 6 seasons any less meaningful, especially the ones before this one. But, oh, by the way, Dillon might still be named all defensive team, probably second team. He's going to be in that mix. He's going to receive a lot of votes for that, and I promise you he's going to have interest in free agency. But that interest maybe has been dumbed down some because of the antics of the last 48 hours. And the frustration with that is one of the main ways that the Memphis Grizzlies can improve this team is via sign and trade. We've talked about that here on Locked On Grizzlies before, DeMichael and I. That avenue still exists. And I think it's still possible for a couple of reasons. You have the ability for Dillon to choose his end game location without having to worry about being sent into cap space, right? That's one of the positives of a sign and trade. It expands the net. It expands the potential list of suitors via trade. Because if Dillon goes out in unrestricted free agency, there's only a couple of things that can happen. He can sign into cap space with a team like the Houston Rockets, which maybe he wants to do. Maybe he wants to go and be that veteran presence that they depend on for scoring in tough times, like he was at the beginning of the John Morant era. Again, you might have forgotten that, dear listener, dear viewer, but I have not. I watched those games in the bubble. I saw rookie John Morant defer to Dillon Brooks numerous times. I saw it with my own two eyes. So I know it's something that happened, and I know that it's something that could happen again on a team like the Houston Rockets, on a team like the Detroit Pistons, on a team like the Charlotte Hornets. If Toronto decides to go the tank route, Dillon is from Ontario, that makes total sense. If Portland, for whatever reason, decides to go in an angle where they move away from Jeremy Grant and they want some more defensive prowess that also has a little more offensive pop than a Matisse Thybulle, Dillon Brooks makes sense there. And some of those teams would work just, again, with cap space. Houston Rockets have a ton of cap space. They could sign Dillon easily. But a team like Portland, a team like Toronto, it's not as simple. So there are moves to be made and angles for Dillon to take. And for everybody that is giving Dillon a hard time, making jokes about him playing in China next season, you clearly haven't watched the guy play. He's one of the top 100 to 125 players in the NBA. You can laugh at that, scoff at that. You have recency bias. He's going to be in that mix for all defensive team, and that is an important skill, especially on the perimeter in the NBA. Did he tank some of his value because of his talking and the way that he played, more importantly, against the Lakers? Yeah, I think he did. But at the same time, that doesn't negate the previous body of work, and teams are going to be interested in having a guy like Dillon Brooks. The market shrinks when under no circumstances is he coming back. Maybe everybody already knew that. Maybe the Shams Charania tweet and article just kind of said the quiet part out loud, like Parker Fleming over at Bluff City Media wrote about. Shout out to Parker, doing great work, as always. I am not so sure that it makes sense for either side because, again, pay raise that Dillon surely wants. Extension, of course, years that are guaranteed, the ability to choose a market that isn't just going to be awful. I think that's important. The Toronto Raptors could go into a move saying that they are going to move on from OG Anunoby because he's going to be too expensive. Dillon will be cheaper than OG. Dillon goes to his home team, his country's team in Canada, is open to a sixth man reserve role, which I, DeMichael, and others have always kind of hoped that Dillon would take on in Memphis, but for understandable reasons. He always saw himself as a starter because that's what he was asked to be forever and for always as a Grizzly, going all the way back to his rookie year. Maybe in a new scenery, in a new piece of scenery, whether it's Toronto, whether it's a place like Portland, Oregon, and the Ducks, where Dillon played college ball, or Portland fans, love Oregon Ducks players, I've been told. So those are two natural landing spots where the edge that Dillon brings and perhaps the poking the bear, LeBron's old, all that sort of drama maybe won't carry as much weight because of the connection he has to those two areas. Or a team like Houston, a team like Charlotte, Detroit, a team that's not going to be good this season. The Memphis Grizzlies weren't supposed to be good the first year of John Morant. And technically, they were in the play-in mix. They weren't good. They were mediocre to below average. But they competed. And one of the reasons they competed was Dillon Brooks. So Dillon Brooks has value, and that value takes a hit when the sign and trade option, while still possible, is now less probable because of the illusion of the Grizzlies potentially wanting to keep Dillon. That's gone. That's vanished. So I don't think Memphis did it. I don't think Dillon did it. And that, I don't have inside sources on that. I don't know why a teammate of his from Oregon or a teammate from his in Memphis or a fellow Canadian basketball player, whatever the case might be, whatever the axe might be to grind. Maybe that's a debate for subsequent episodes of Locked On Grizzlies with DeMichael. But I don't think Memphis or Dillon leaked it. And I do think that JJ Redick put it really well in terms of the agenda-driven media, because he's exactly right. We're going to talk later on throughout the rest of this episode of other things the Memphis Grizzlies need to fix. There are multiple problems for them to get to the stated goal of NBA Finals contendership. Dillon Brooks is not the only issue there. But because there's sound bites and because there's Dillon the villain memes and animations that you can make, that gets the highlights, that gets the headlines. Memphis Grizzlies have other fish to fry, and that's what we're going to focus the rest of this episode of Locked On Grizzlies on, starting with an interesting quote that I've mentioned earlier in the week from the end of season media availability this past Sunday from Zach Kleiman. A good moment of accountability and a good moment of a moment to reflect on what last offseason was. We're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by eBay Motors. We are huge fans of eBay Motors here at Locked On Grizzlies. And I got to tell you, to have a championship team, each and every piece matters, right? It's extremely important that everybody fits well together. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, you need to head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know if the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win with the right parts when they are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. We are talking the fit of Zach Kleiman and the youth of the Memphis Grizzlies when we're come back here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax, flying solo. As mentioned earlier in the show, DeMichael Cole of the Memphis Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Grizzlies beat writer, all of the craziness going on surrounding Dillon Brooks. He is kind of not necessarily in the thick of it, but he's following it pretty closely, and that's as far as I can go. So make sure you're staying with Locked On Grizzlies, because obviously I talk to DeMichael every day, even on days where he's not able to be on the show. And between all the access and insight that DeMichael has, combine that with, again, I've been covering this team for a decade. When DeMichael was in high school, I was covering this team. Grizzly Bear Blues, SB Nation, Bluff City Media, all sorts of different places I've written and covered the team, NBA credentialed media. Between the two of us, we got you straight when it comes to the Grizzlies offseason at hand. And for Memphis, Zach Kleiman, and I've mentioned this earlier this week, the quote that really stood out to me from Kleiman, the Grizzlies general manager, was the tripling down on youth. Was that really something that was necessary going into this coming season? Because that's exactly what they did, right? The move away from Kyle Anderson, the move away from DeAnthony Melton, who, by the way, is still playing in the playoffs right now for the Philadelphia 76ers, playing alongside the NBA MVP and Joel Embiid, a former MVP and James Harden. Do you think DeAnthony Melton misses the Memphis Grizzlies? I mean, him and Ja were friends, probably still are friends, but Melton might be in the mix for an NBA Finals look. So I'm not sure he misses those guys all that much at this moment. Maybe he's thankful that Zach Kleiman made the triple down on youth. And that is the thing that I wanted to focus on in this part of the show, because I think it opens the door to the possibility of a sign and trade with Dillon Brooks, to a trade of Tyus Jones, to a signing using the mid-level exception to bring in a veteran, roughly $12 million that Zach Kleiman said it is a priority of Memphis to use this offseason. They have openings to try to make this team better, and they are going to do their darndest. I think they did their due diligence at the trade deadline, like we talked about in previous episodes of Locked On Grizzlies. They reportedly offered 4 first-round picks for Mikal Bridges. Was it Dillon Brooks? Was it Ty Jones? What were they trying to use there? Maybe Danny Green's contract, whatever the case might be. 4 first-round picks ain't nothing, folks, right? Like, that is most certainly something. Another report that says they offered literally everything, pick swaps, every pick they could send for Kevin Durant. Durant didn't want to play in Memphis. He wanted to go to Phoenix. That was always kind of an acknowledged done deal, but Memphis tried, and I think they're going to continue to try. But if you remember correctly, dear listener, dear viewer, I was calling for them to try last summer, and I talked myself into them doing a heat check, if you remember correctly. Last summer was their heat check. They were buying into the Zaire Williams development. They were buying in to John Conchar being an end-of-the-rotation player. They were buying in to having pieces that were malleable, versatile defensively, different skill sets like Jake LaRavia as a shooter, David Roddy off the bounce, being able to be a small ball big. They bought into that hook, line, and sinker. And I believed it because I wanted to believe that Zach Kleiman was continuing to walk the line of contenderdom while also acknowledging how young his roster is. And that is something that Grizzlies fans don't like to talk about. If Memphis won the NBA championship this year, they would be one of, if not the youngest team to ever do so. The Portland Trailblazers in the 1970s are the last team that was this young that won a championship. That's almost 50 years of precedent in history that we're talking about. Young teams don't win at that level. So we can, and I'm guilty of it too. Don't get me wrong. I picked the Grizzlies to win the NBA championship. Why not? This is Locked On Grizzlies, baby. All of you can yell at me all you want. I believed. Even with the injuries, I believed. And I believed that this was an opportunity for Zach Kleiman to show that his belief in the type of player they were drafting, the chip on their shoulder, the caliber of play, the skill set they possessed, regardless of age, they were going to fit into an impressive Grizzlies culture. Again, doesn't feel that way right now, right? To say that they have an impressive culture feels like a darn silly thing to say after the 2022-2023 season has concluded. But do not forget, this time last year, all the joy that the Sacramento Kings and their fans, deservedly so, are feeling. Coach of the year here, clutch player of the year there, executive of the year, overachiever, amazing season. That was literally the Memphis Grizzlies this time last year. Ja Morant, most improved player, right? All of these awards and all of these accolades, all these things that were coming into being, executive of the year, Zach Kleiman, that was all stuff that was happening for Memphis after a 56-win season and the number 2 seed. And the bottom has seemingly, it feels this way, maybe it's not entirely true, fallen out. So for him to say, do we really need to triple down on youth? I think that, again, we talk about opening windows. The window for a sign and trade with Dillon is still there. I believe that they are going to take some of these young pieces that they have acquired, and they will be aggressive. It takes 2 to tango. Got to find a partner for a trade. But I mentioned Portland earlier. Nasir Little makes a lot of sense in terms of being a wing to take a shot on. Mentioned Toronto earlier, OG Anunoby. If Fred VanVleet walks in free agency, goes to Orlando or one of these other places that has cap space, and he goes to be their starting point guard, and Toronto doesn't necessarily want to give up everything. They still have Scotty Barnes, Pascal Siakam. Maybe they're willing to move on from OG Anunoby for a Tyus Jones and some first-round picks. Maybe now it's Toronto's turn to walk that line of contenderdom, of playoff contention, while also acquiring assets like first-round selections. Maybe Memphis sweetens the deal with Zaire Williams, who was one of the pieces that they bet on last year. And it didn't work out because of injury and because Zaire's advancement of play just didn't manifest. Does Zaire relate to Dillon Brooks today a little bit? Maybe. Dillon thinks he could be used in a different way. Do you think Zaire Williams, who DeMichael and I have both talked about being a good mid-range shooter, but he doesn't get those opportunities? Do you think Zaire maybe can relate a bit? Maybe. Tyus Zaire and a couple of firsts for OG Anunoby? Do they say no in Toronto? Maybe. Do they say no to a sign and trade in Portland with those pieces for Jeremy Grant? Maybe. Maybe not. You make those calls. They have the ability to do that. And again, OG Anunoby would make them younger, right? That's one of the ironies. But Jeremy Grant, a little bit older. If they go and pursue a Chris Middleton, that's been a name that's been floated out there. That'd be really difficult to do. You probably need a 3-team trade. That's a big salary coming back. DeMar DeRozan of Chicago. There are potential pieces that could be in conversations that we'll continue to have here on Locked On Grizzlies, of course, as the offseason grinds along. But the need for veteran presence, it's good to hear Kleiman say that, because they have to find a way to improve this team. And the the key to this offseason, and again, something else I'll talk to DeMichael about here in the future, the tripling down on youth. Do you bring in an OG Anunoby who's roughly the same age as a Desmond Bane, John Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr.? That's a heck of a core for the next several years. Or do you bring in a DeMar DeRozan potentially, or a Chris Middleton, and try to have a veteran presence that is like that? It's an interesting question. Or do you double down on depth instead of tripling down on youth and go get a Dorian Finney-Smith and an Alex Caruso? Maybe another piece here or there, using that MLE, that mid-level exception. And now you're replacing Brandon Clark, at least for the year. You're keeping up with the Joneses in terms of defense. You don't have to lose a ton for those types of players. And you're hopefully amplifying the talent of your big three stars, John Morant, Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr. How he perceives that need to no longer triple down, I guess would be quadruple down on youth, is going to be a fascinating storyline to watch unfold as the offseason continues to progress. And we'll have you covered on that and more here on Locked On Grizzlies. We're going to finish our show today talking about Taylor Jenkins and his acknowledgement of needing to watch some film, maybe some ways to sync up the offense a little bit more cleanly. We'll talk about that later here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a wonderful way to try to spend better time on yourself. How much time do you spend on yourself? How much do you spend on others? Do you balance those two? When we're giving all of our time in terms of others, we can easily stretch ourselves out too thin and feel burned out. Therapy can give you the tools to find more balance in your life so you can support others while not leaving yourself behind. If you're thinking of starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try. Entirely online, designed to be convenient. You fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. Plus, it's flexible and suited to your schedule. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We're going to finish out this episode of Locked On Grizzlies looking at Taylor Jenkins and ways that he can evolve the offense. Starting that conversation next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax, once again flying solo. My co-host, DeMichael Cole, knee-deep in Dillon Brooks muckety-muck, right? Trying to figure out all that's going on there. So it made sense for this Thursday edition, the Star Wars Day edition, I should say, of Locked On Grizzlies, for me to be the Anakin Skywalker walking alone, hopefully not doing the terrible things that Anakin did, but being that solo voice, solo force, choosing to be the lonely ranger, so to speak, moving along here as our episode comes to a close here on this Thursday. Taylor Jenkins talked in his end-of-season media availability, and again, throughout this whole week, that has been kind of the theme of our show, the theme of our shows. Obviously, Dillon has intersected that a little bit, but Taylor Jenkins talked about the need to watch a lot of film, do some soul searching through film dives, and find ways to raise the offense and the half-court offense in particular around guys like Jaren Jackson Jr., John Morant, and Desmond Bane. I wrote a piece over at bluffcitymedia.co, which I would highly recommend that you go check out, bluffcitymedia.co/join. Use the promo code Mullinax, 10% off a subscription annually, plus you get a 10-day free trial. bluffcitymedia.co. That's where Grizzly Bear Blues has gone to, where I used to be the site manager, where Parker Fleming currently is the site manager. His work, Sean Coleman, who used to be the host of this podcast, or one of the hosts of this podcast, so many more. Bluff City Media, well worth the money. So highly recommend you go bluffcitymedia.co/join. Use the promo code Mullinax. I wrote about two ways that the 2024 NBA Finals can be progressed toward for the Memphis Grizzlies. And I mentioned the sign and trade stuff that I talked about earlier in the show, but I also wrote about the need to get those three guys going, especially with Jaren Jackson Jr. as a screener, because he in the pick and roll has not been a focus. That is not something that Jaren has really prioritized with John Morant or Desmond Bane. And the numbers back that up. I can't stress enough. I was surprised in doing the research for my piece just how little Jaren was active in the pick and roll as a screener, as a player offensively alongside Ja Morant and Desmond Bane. He was in the postseason. He had 2.2 screen assists, and this is from the piece over at bluffcitymedia.co. 2.2 screen assists, which was 20th in the NBA in the playoffs. 5.5 screen assist points, that was 19th. That is well behind what he did in the regular season, only 1.3 screen assists and 3.1 screen assist points. And again, that's all from NBA.com/stats. With Steven Adams out, with Brandon Clark out, Jaren had to be more of a screener. They don't necessarily want him to do that, but I would argue he needs to do that more for a couple of reasons. Initiating a half-court set with Jaren Jackson Jr. as the primary screener for a Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Tyus Jones if he's still around, Luke Kennard for the same reason, whoever it might be. Initiating it with Jaren helps diversify your offense. It allows for a Steven Adams to set an off-ball screen for a Luke Kennard to get open from three, or a Desmond Bane, a Santi Aldama even, in terms of if they go big. There are so many more options there to use the size of Steven Adams in a different way. He doesn't have to be that primary screen setter all the time. And Jaren can receive the ball off the bounce, off a direct pass, off a skip pass, coming off of a flare screen. He can do it in the pick and pop motion. He can get downhill in a way to get to the lane, to finish well, which he's shown he has the capacity to do throughout the season. Making him that primary initiator of the screen portion of the pick and roll, that needs to be a priority because it opens up the possibilities for the Memphis offense, and it allows for Jaren to get the ball himself in a different way than he normally does, coming off of an Adams screen from the initial pick and roll motion, whether he's out on the elbow, whether he's on the perimeter, spotting up for a three. Finding ways to get those guys to play better together because their numbers together are fine. Their net rating is stout, especially in the regular season. They got outplayed by the Lakers. We've talked about that. Anthony Davis was dominant. He's currently dominating the Golden State Warriors. Credit to Anthony Davis. He's doing what a lot of people, myself included, thought he wasn't going to be able to do. That AD is a major problem in the NBA that only perhaps a Nikola Jokic or a Joel Embiid right now can solve. And even then, it's probably going to be challenging. So kudos to the Lakers that are playing good ball. But at the same time, there were things that Memphis could have done in that series that would have put themselves in better positions offensively to get those role players that struggled better looks. And I think it starts with getting Jaren more comfortable in that primary initiation set. So I hope that's one of the things that Taylor Jenkins is talking about offensively when it comes to diversifying the offense, doing some film dives. Defensively, finding ways to not let Rui Hachimura get into rhythm would be a good idea. And I'm hopeful that he learns from his predecessor, Mike Budenholzer, who is currently still in the mix in Milwaukee. We're thinking of him and his family. I know there was a recent tragedy for them. I think the brother passed away. But there were rumors that he might be on the chopping block, and we'll see if that comes to pass in terms of being fired from the Bucks. But Budenholzer has a pretty impressive coaching tree, and Taylor Jenkins is one of the limbs on that tree. And Taylor Jenkins needs to not be stubborn with the way that he defends, because they give up so many three-pointers. And the three-point shot with each season that passes becomes more and more easy for NBA players. They prioritize it. Teams continue to prioritize it, do the analytics movement, the efficiency of that shot. It is a focus, and players are going to keep getting better at it. And with that reality comes the reality that you have to defend it more effectively. So just collapsing into the paint and forcing teams to beat you from three, obviously Memphis has had regular season success. I'm not saying you go away from that philosophy entirely, but it seems like they haven't had the ability to fully adjust. And there were adjustments. If you watch those games, there was a lot more switching in the Lakers series. The Grizzlies did a lot of different things to try to limit AD, fronting him, trying to put him in tougher spots. The Lakers just had solid counterpunches off of those adjustments. But it can't just be an adjustment for a particular opponent. It has to be a schematic adjustment. It has to be an understanding of where you're supposed to be, how you better position your body, the angles that you take, how you attack the rim on the defensive end in terms of rim protection, weak side help, who is the biggest threat, where do you want them to take their shots? It's called defense for a reason, right? The offense is going to get opportunity. Where do you want them to take those shots? Who do you want to take those shots? In fairness to Memphis, that strategy in and of itself worked. Rui Hachimura was the one they wanted to shoot. Desmond Bane said it himself. Rui Hachimura made the shots. But how do you counter once the guy that you wanted to make the shot makes the shot? You can't just throw up your hands and say, oh, good series. The Lakers win, I guess. The counterpunch. I want to continue to see how Jenkins develops that going into his next season. Because you got to remember, he's still a young head coach. Not an excuse. Could have been better. He got outcoached by Darvin Ham. I think he would say that. I certainly will say it. But he has won over 100 regular season games these last 2 years. The Grizzlies have been the 2 seed the last 2 seasons. He has to evolve for playoff basketball. And hopefully we'll see the end result of that down the road, what studying, hopefully after a vacation, spending time with his kids, the work that he puts in to develop as a coach, not just the work that his players put in to develop. Thank you so much for making this episode of Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today and every day. Shout out to our everydayers, whether you're checking us out on YouTube, whether you're listening wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you're subscribed. You can rate, review, comment, like. All of those things are wonderful. Engage with us, interact with us, continue to make Locked On Grizzlies part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content experience. Our Friday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Fingers crossed we won't have to talk about Dillon Brooks. We might have to, right? DeMichael is not here on this episode because he's getting more intel and doing some more digging. So maybe he'll have some more insight onto what's going on with Dillon. But continuing to look at what this roster needs to, because again, I want to shout out JJ Redick, one of the best NBA media people out there right now. If you are a fair observer of this Grizzlies team, the Lakers exposed several weaknesses in Memphis. How those things are addressed and how within the end of season media availability, both the players and the staff, Taylor Jenkins, Zach Kleiman, looking for clues as to how they're going to address those things. That'll be the focus of our Friday episode of Locked On Grizzlies. So hopefully you'll be able to check in and chat with us and be with us for our end of the week episode. I imagine you will be, because you're an everydayer at this point. You love, look at this face if you're on YouTube. How could you say no? Listen to this beautiful baritone voice if you're listening wherever you get your podcasts. How could you say no to this, right? It's very difficult to. So until next time, I'm Joe Mullinax. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Stay locked in. Enjoy your Star Wars day, and we will see you for Cinco de Mayo, a special Friday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Thanks again. Talk to you soon.